During the heated televised segment, the moment that sparked the most attention came when a bold and unapologetic conservative voice directly confronted years of vague insinuations and unproven narratives. Without hesitation, she took on the talking points that had dominated political discussions and legacy media narratives, dismantling them with precision and confidence. She zeroed in on a pattern of public declarations made in the past, declarations that promised the presence of damning information, only to later result in no concrete evidence, no smoking gun, and no legal accountability. It wasn't just about political disagreement. It was about calling out a sustained campaign of suggestion masquerading as certainty. The energy in the room shifted the moment she brought the issue back to its fundamentals. Her argument was simple, yet powerful. If there truly had been ironclad evidence of wrongdoing, where was it? Where were the indictments directly tied to those fiery claims? Where were the facts that justified years of speculation, congressional hearings, media frenzy, and public division? By posing those questions live and unfiltered, she forced the conversation out of the abstract and into the realm of reality, where proof matters more than perception. What made her critique particularly striking was the tone, sharp, unwavering, and laced with just enough incredulity to make the point sting. It wasn't the kind of reserved inquiry that allows for political escape routes. It was direct. It was deliberate. She laid out a case rooted in the reality of what the public had seen: countless television appearances, cryptic hints about more to come, and the repeated framing of accusations as settled. Truth before due process ever had its say. And yet, the final outcomes failed to live up to the drama of the buildup. This moment resonated with viewers because it tapped into a broader frustration that many feel toward the political media complex: the use of serious allegations as political weapons, without the responsibility to follow through with substantive proof. She exposed this tactic for what it was: a bait-and-switch operation designed more to sway public opinion than to deliver justice. She reminded the audience that speculation, no matter how dramatic or confidently stated, is not evidence. And when public trust is placed in institutions to investigate wrongdoing, that trust must not be manipulated for partisan gain. Even more compelling was her ability to maintain composure while delivering such a cutting critique. She didn't shout. She didn't flail. She presented her points with clarity, using calm logic to strip away layers of obfuscation. That contrast made the impact of her words all the more powerful. It wasn't just an emotional rebuttal. It was a methodical deconstruction of a narrative that had been accepted far too easily for far too long. Viewers watching in real time saw not only the substance of what she was saying, but also the confidence of someone who knew that the facts, or lack thereof, were on her side. As the exchange continued, the tension on the other side of the screen grew more palpable. Attempts to counter her points felt more like evasions than refutations. There was a visible discomfort in trying to defend statements that had aged poorly, especially when the promises of damning revelations had never materialized. Her adversary's fallback strategy was to allude to vague connections and rely on past reports, but the contrast between past insinuations and current realities was now impossible to ignore. She also subtly pointed out that years of media, airtime, and breathless coverage had failed to produce a single definitive piece of evidence to justify the scale of the allegations made. The implication was clear. The American public had been sold a narrative built more on political need than factual discovery. And now, in this moment, someone was finally saying out loud what many had been thinking for years: that the emperor had no clothes. What made the moment so resonant was that it wasn't just about politics. It was about accountability, about truth, about how much we as a society are willing to let powerful people say whatever suits their goals without being challenged. She didn't let it slide. She didn't let it go unchecked. Instead, she peeled back the polished exterior of rhetoric and exposed the hollow center where evidence was supposed to be. That kind of confrontation, rare and refreshing, is what made the exchange unforgettable. In the midst of the charged exchange, one side chose to lean heavily on the foundation of previous investigations, citing them as justification for years of claims that had shaped public perception. This defense strategy relied on the notion that earlier inquiries carried out by federal agencies and high-level officials had unearthed enough concerning interactions and circumstantial evidence to warrant suspicion. It wasn't a full-throated reaffirmation of the initial explosive assertions, but rather a retreat into the gray area of inference and implication. The defense emphasized meetings that took place between campaign affiliates and foreign individuals, the exchange of data and polling information, and ambiguous statements made during a turbulent political season. Each of these details had been reported before, scrutinized, dissected, and analyzed endlessly by media outlets, lawmakers, and the public. But now, they were being repackaged as the underlying reasons why the original allegations were not only made, but supposedly justified. What stood out was the reliance on interpretation over demonstration. There was no presentation of a direct quote, document, or action that conclusively tied individuals to the grand narrative that had previously been sold with such certainty. Instead, the defense subtly pivoted to a tone of caution and nuance, suggesting that while there may not have been definitive proof, there was enough activity in the shadows to raise concerns. This change in tone was not lost on viewers. It represented a shift from confidence to justification, from bold declarations to cautious hedging. This approach, however, didn't land with the same force as it might have in the past. By now, the public had seen the outcome of those investigations. They had watched as major inquiries, including some carried out with sweeping authority and resources, concluded with no criminal charges directly tied to the most damning claims. And still, the defense leaned on what had already been parsed and processed by the American public. This reliance on the fog of past investigations came across as both strategic and desperate. Strategic, because it allowed the speaker to avoid admitting error. Desperate, because it suggested there was little new to offer in the way of actual proof. It was an attempt to frame the conversation around interpretation rather than absolutes, which may have worked in quieter times but fell flat against the clarity demanded in a live and unfiltered setting. Adding to the disconnect was the inconsistency in how the results of those investigations were framed. On one hand, the defense leaned into their importance and credibility, using them as shields against criticism. On the other hand, any lack of conclusive findings was brushed off as a failure of the process, not of the original claims. This contradictory positioning didn't escape notice. It painted a picture of selective trust, trusting the process when it aligned with the narrative, dismissing it when it did not. Furthermore, by anchoring the argument in the realm of possibility, rather than evidence, the defense unwittingly highlighted the very problem being pointed out in the first place: years of insinuation that had never matured into verification. The retelling of past events, no matter how detailed, could not substitute for the absence of a smoking gun. This was particularly evident when viewers realized that what was being offered as a defense was not new information, but recycled talking, points already challenged by time and transparency. The more the argument leaned on concerns and patterns rather than facts, the clearer it became that the original narrative had overreached. It had promised a revelation, a scandal, of historical proportions, and instead delivered a string of circumstantial threads that never tied together. In real time, that contrast between promise and performance was being exposed, not by documents or depositions, but by the weakness of the defense's own framing. The tactic of deferring to prior investigations also carried an air of institutional deflection, as if to say, we're not responsible for what people believed, just look at the reports. But the reports had been read, the hearings had been watched, and the lack of finality had been noted. In the end, appealing to authority without acknowledging the limitations of those authorities only further damaged credibility. While the attempt was to appear measured and responsible, what came across instead was an unwillingness to concede that past conclusions did not match prior convictions. The insistence on concerning behavior instead of outright wrongdoing now seemed like a hollow echo, falling short in a setting that demanded clarity. That gap between accusation and proof was not bridged by repetition. It was widened. And, the more the defense leaned on investigations that had already been digested and dismissed by much of the public, the more evident it became that there was little left to stand on, but speculation retrofitted as justification. A critical moment in the exchange came when the conservative commentator shifted the spotlight away from the talking points and legal ambiguity to something far more human and far more potent: ambition. With precision and timing, she posed an unspoken question to viewers, one that lingered behind the statistics and statements. What was the real motive behind the years of speculation, hearings, and bold proclamations? By drawing attention to the timing, tone, and persistence of certain narratives, she implicitly suggested that personal gain, not principle, had been the driving force behind them. Her framing was subtle but effective. Rather than engaging in a blow-for-blow argument about facts and legal outcomes, she zoomed out and painted a broader picture, one in which political maneuvering often disguises itself as public service. She suggested that the carefully orchestrated media appearances, the loaded language used during public hearings, and the repeated allusions to damning evidence that never fully emerged were not just miscalculations or overstatements. Instead, they could be understood as strategic moves in a long game aimed at raising a personal profile, building a brand, and cultivating a national presence. This perspective resonated because it tapped into a deep public skepticism. People are increasingly aware of how political theater operates, how some figures craft narratives not for the sake of truth, but to sustain relevance, dominate headlines, and prepare for the next rung up the ladder. In this context, she wasn't just arguing over facts. She was indicting a pattern of behavior where public fear and institutional trust were leveraged for individual benefit. What gave her argument weight was her ability to connect the dots without slipping into conspiracy. She didn't need to make wild claims or leap to outrageous conclusions. Instead, she simply reminded viewers to follow the trajectory, how controversies were maximized, how every new development became a soundbite, how each press appearance seemed less about informing the public and more about generating attention. The frequency and intensity of these public appearances were telling. When someone repeatedly inserts themselves into every news cycle, especially with inflammatory predictions that rarely materialize, it becomes difficult to ignore the signs of self-promotion. Her critique gained further traction when she pointed to the way the media was enlisted, knowingly or not, as a tool in this self-serving campaign. News networks ran with dramatic quotes and suggestive language. Headlines fueled speculation without evidence. And through it all, one voice kept returning to the center of the storm, always with a new angle, a fresh warning, a reason to keep watching. In that environment, staying in the spotlight was not just a byproduct of circumstance, it looked like the goal itself. She also noted that political capital is often built not by solving problems, but by sustaining them. The longer a controversy lasts, the longer someone can ride the wave, remain relevant, and build a base of support among those who mistake relentless messaging for principled leadership. Her critique was that what began as an investigation into serious concerns had, over time, become a personal project, a vehicle for gaining influence, credibility within certain circles, and ultimately power. Even more compelling was the contrast. She drew between the initial stakes and the final outcomes. If someone truly believed in the urgency and severity of what they claimed, then the absence of follow-through, no prosecutions, no direct accountability, should have prompted self-reflection, or even regret. But instead of humility, there was defiance. Instead of walking back overstatements, there was a doubling down. That, she argued, was not the behavior of someone focused on truth. It was the behavior of someone too invested in the persona they had built to ever let it go. This line of critique didn't rely on deep legal knowledge or classified information. It relied on observation, logic, and a keen sense of political dynamics. Viewers didn't need to know every detail of the hearings or read every report. They simply needed to think critically about who benefited most from the years of controversy, and how those benefits translated into speaking invitations, television contracts, campaign donations, and broader public recognition. By framing the issue in terms of character and motive rather than just evidence, she changed the nature of the conversation. It was no longer a question of who was right or wrong on a technical level. It was a question of who was using serious national concerns for personal gain. In doing so, she shifted the burden of proof from documents to actions, from claims to consequences. And in that light, the contrast between public performance and private ambition became impossible to ignore. As the live exchange unfolded and clips of it began circulating online within minutes, the response from the public was both immediate and deeply divided. What became clear was not just the content of what had been said, but how it reflected the broader cultural and political fault lines already simmering beneath the surface. On one side of the digital landscape, voices erupted in praise for the sharpness, the courage, and the willingness to challenge what many viewed as an entrenched narrative pushed by the media and the political establishment. On the other, there was outrage, some accusing the speaker of being disrespectful, others claiming she was spreading misinformation, and still others arguing that her style was more spectacle than substance. This divergence in reactions was not merely about party, allegiance, or ideological identity. It spoke to something deeper, the way people now interpret information based not only on what is said, but on who is saying it and how it aligns with their existing worldview. The same sentence could be viewed as a necessary truth bomb by one viewer and an irresponsible attack by another. In today's media ecosystem, perception often carries more weight than fact, and that was on full display as reactions to the segment poured in across platforms like X, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. For those who saw the moment as a long overdue reckoning, the appeal was both emotional and intellectual. Here was someone willing to cut through layers of political doublespeak, challenge authority in real time, and do so with conviction. To them, it wasn't just about winning a debate, it was about affirming a long-standing suspicion that narratives had been manipulated and trust had been abused. These supporters saw the exchange as a vindication, a moment when someone finally said out loud what many had been thinking quietly for years. It felt raw, real, and deeply satisfying. For others, however, the segment was disturbing. Critics pointed to the tone as combative, even disrespectful. They felt that challenging complex issues in such a direct and unrelenting manner diminished the seriousness of the subject. Some even questioned the motivations behind the performance, suggesting it was designed more for viral traction than civic engagement. Others worried that such aggressive approaches erode the norms of civil discourse, further polarizing a nation already stretched thin by division and distrust. Yet, the most interesting element wasn't the disagreement itself. It was the way that disagreement played out in echo chambers. Algorithms on social media ensured that people mostly saw reactions that confirmed what they already believed. Those who praised the speaker were inundated with edits, memes, and supportive commentary that reinforced their admiration. Meanwhile, critics were fed think pieces, reaction videos, and tweets that validated their outrage. Each side became more certain, more entrenched, and less willing to entertain the possibility that the truth might exist somewhere in between. What this moment illustrated with stark clarity is that political communication today doesn't happen in a shared space. It happens in silos, each with its own heroes and villains, each with its own language and expectations. When someone speaks boldly, it doesn't simply inform or persuade, it activates tribes. It becomes a moment of cultural identity as much as a moment of debate. And because of that, the consequences of even a single media appearance ripple far, beyond the studio, shaping opinions, entrenching divisions, and fueling the next cycle of outrage and affirmation. This wasn't just a political skirmish. It was a mirror held up to the nation's current state of dialogue. The polarization was so acute that even facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice were analyzed endlessly by supporters and detractors alike. Some marveled at the composure and confidence. Others mocked the delivery or questioned the authenticity. No moment was too small to be turned into content, no sentence too minor to escape interpretation. The entire event became a cultural artifact, dissected, memed, defended, attacked, and ultimately consumed. And that, perhaps, is what made it so significant. It wasn't just about what was said, it was about how America reacts to confrontation, how it processes dissent, and how far apart people have drifted in what they consider truth. It showed that the lines between information and identity, between debate and performance, have blurred to the point where each political moment becomes not just a clash of ideas, but a battle for narrative supremacy. The exchange, in all its tension and theatricality, simply revealed what had already been brewing. A country where watching the same event doesn't bring people together, but pushes them even further apart. In the wake of the fiery exchange, one thing became abundantly clear. Moments like these are no longer just political debates. They are cultural events. The confrontation served as a microcosm of the broader political climate, where facts, tone, and motive are filtered through a fractured national lens. In this age of 24/7 media cycles, every word, gesture, and rhetorical jab is dissected, repurposed, and weaponized by various factions hungry for validation. Yet underneath the surface-level drama lies something more consequential: the slow erosion of a shared national understanding. What makes this particular incident stand out is not simply the content of what was said, but the broader implications of how it was received. On one hand, it energized a base that has long felt ignored, ridiculed, or dismissed by political elites and legacy institutions. On the other, it reinforced fears among critics that civility, nuance, and measured debate are being replaced by performance, provocation, and sensationalism. Both sides see something very different in the same moment, and therein lies the challenge. How can a nation move forward when even reality feels subjective? The speaker's performance, commanding, unfiltered, and unapologetic, struck a chord with those who believe political correctness and institutional arrogance have suppressed honest dialogue for too long. Her ability to articulate long-standing grievances in real time without deferring to scripted or sanitized language made her not just a participant in the debate, but a symbol of defiance. Whether one agrees with her or not, her confidence and willingness to challenge the status quo brought attention to voices that often feel left out of national conversations. At the same time, the intense polarization that followed only deepened the divides. The fierce reactions revealed a public that increasingly interprets events through ideological frameworks rather than objective standards. Facts are weighed not on their merit, but on who presents them. Arguments are judged not by their logic, but by their allegiance. In such an environment, truth becomes fragmented, and the space for genuine consensus continues to shrink. This moment also raises a sobering question about the future of political discourse. Is it possible to challenge authority, question narratives, and hold powerful people accountable without devolving into spectacle? Can sharp, passionate commentary coexist with integrity and civic responsibility? The answer is not simple, but the demand for both is growing louder. Ultimately, what unfolded on live television was more than a clash between two political figures. It was a reflection of where the country is and where it might be headed. In the search for truth, accountability, and meaningful dialogue. Moments like this can either illuminate the path forward or cast a longer shadow on an already divided nation. The responsibility now lies not just with those in front of the cameras, but with the public. How we listen, how we respond, and how we choose to interpret what we see.